Coming to you live from the closet of my office as to not disturb my wife, child, and 10-pound weenie dog. This is Mark S. with another edition of FBGT, another snowy edition of FBGT. Though I promise this isn't a weather podcast, but Farmer's Almanac did have us down for a cold one this year, so I wonder what's actually more accurate, the Farmer's Almanac or your favorite set of projections. Speaking of projections, I spent my afternoon yesterday and today mixing in my little secret sauce of systems and tweaking some playing time in my sheet. I've updated my NFBC draft lists again, so the horse is in the barn, the chicken's in the pot. Someone's going to get that blank check reference, I swear. But the car's really starting to feel warmed up here. The heated steering wheel's really getting that proper temperature. We're rolling now, folks. We're getting into serious draft season, and my tools are starting to really kind of align with my thoughts, and my draft prep is starting to feel in a really good spot. So this is an exciting time, and this is an exciting episode. It's so exciting that I actually had our intern, which would be my expiring ChatGPT subscription, whip up some graphics for this one. So if you're watching on YouTube, you're going to get an extra special treat, which I think is pretty helpful because this is going to be a statistics heavy podcast. Although I think it's still digestible, but just to call that out early. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the big 10 individual categories, the 10 big roto categories, and we're going to get a feel for how much depth there is in the player pool. So what stats you might need where and which might be the hardest to find. I found the results of this research fascinating, and I really wasn't thinking that this was going to be something that stood out to me when I went into it. I was just kind of doing it. I wanted to see what the numbers looked like, but when I actually looked at the results, I was really floored by them, and especially on the pitching side. So it's personally helped give me some clarity entering the beginning of what we're going to call serious draft season. So let's dive in and we can get right into it. So it's simple, right? Which stats are the hardest to find? We're going to go category by category through the Big 10 roto groups and look at them in groups of 50 based on ADP. So in other words, the guys that are being drafted in groups 50 to 100, 100 to 150, all the way up to 300. And then I added some notes beyond 300 on the type of volume you can expect to find at each given category. So a little bit more about the methodology. I used an average of the 80th percentile goals as per the Bubba and the Bloom draft tracking sheet. You can find them in the process, in the appendix of the process as well, I believe. So the projections I'm using are going to be a mix of ATC and the BATX for hitters and oopsie and steamers for pitchers, which is personally my little blend that I like to use. I'm leaning towards ATC playing time for the bats as well. I know that they're notorious, I think, for having the most accurate playing time. So, and I know it's really early right now, and that's going to change too, but that's how I'm getting the projections that we're using to lay this whole system out. And I was thinking about this because I was trying to think of which categories I should be prioritizing early. So by extension, which ones might be available later. However, what I found was in a lot of cases, there isn't much of anything left later. It's a testament to the early ADP, which is again what we're sorting for here, which is really important to remember. I'm not just going through my projections and telling you about the rankings. I'm using the ADP to kind of create these buckets. There we go. It took about 5 minutes probably. I'm using the ADP to create these buckets so that we can see what's missing as you go down the draft board. So let's get into it right now. And we're going to start with some of the ones that I would say were, I don't want to say obvious, but some of the ones that I was expecting to see. FBGT. Okay, so we're going to start on the hitting side, and we're going to look at average and stolen base first. I would say these are probably the most predictable outcomes that I would have expected. So for average, what I was using as the benchmark was a 257 average, which is, again, the 80th percentile, what you would be shooting for if you were aiming for 80th percentile when you're drafting. So obviously, in all of these categories, those first 50 to 100 picks are going to be loaded. That's where most of the talent's going to lie because you're still cleaning up after those first few rounds. In 15-team leagues, you're literally still in the fourth round. So these are big-time players. They're always going to pop. So 50 to 100, you've got 16 players with at least a 257 average. From 101 to 150, it drops down to 9, so it almost cuts in half. From 150 to 200, you get a slight uptick again, back to 11. And then from 200 to 250, you've got 5 players who are hitting 257 or better. From 250 to 300, it's 6 players. And then beyond pick 300, there are only 15 players projected with a 257 or better average, and that's with at least 200 plate appearances. When you look at stolen bases, the benchmark we're going to use here, the 80th percentile mark, is going to be 13. For picks 50 to 100, there are 12 players who steal at least 13 bases. For picks 101 to 150, there are 10 players who are stealing at least 13 bases. 150 to 200, it's 7 players. 200 to 250 is 9 players. 250 to 300 is 4 players. And then there are 25 players beyond 300 projected for 13 plus steals. This is, I should have said this before, I'm using 12-team ADP data, but I think the ADP is pretty homogenous. I don't think it really varies that much from a 12 to 15 league. You might see closers get pushed up early on, but I think for the most part, they're pretty interchangeable for the purposes of this exercise. So stolen bases with 25 beyond pick 300. I think stolen bases are probably the easiest thing to find when you're looking for that 80th percentile benchmark. And in general, both average and stolen bases are pretty available at any point, obviously more in the early going, but you can get them at pretty much any time. So that's pretty important to remember. You don't want to start with a bunch of average tankers and then have to try and pick it up later, because they're not like 300 guys. But it's still something that you can find later. So maybe not something that you want to prioritize in the second round, maybe with like a Trey Turner or something. I actually just did this and I kind of regret it a little bit. So interestingly enough, that's pretty much the end of the stats that are readily available pretty much anywhere. And this is where I thought it started to get interesting, because I really would have thought that I could find some more of these stats later on in the drafts, but it turns out that's not true. And I'm talking about home runs here. So for home runs, the benchmark we're using here is going to be 23 home runs. You've got 17 players picked 50 to 100 that fall with 23 or more home runs. When you go to picks 101 to 150, it drops down to 10. From 150 to 200, it actually drops all the way down to 6. Interestingly enough, from 200 to 250, it jumps back up to 12, which is the highest kind of bucket of home run hitters beyond picks 50 to 100. And then there are only 3 players beyond pick 250 that are projected for 23 home runs. So 1 in that 250 to 300, and then only 2 more beyond that. So home runs are falling off of a cliff after pick 200. You can get power pretty much anywhere prior. Like I said, picks 200 to 250 is really interesting that there's 12 players there. But while steals and average can be found almost anywhere later, you are not getting power later. So you need to make sure you are prioritizing a power base early when you're drafting right now. When you switch over to the counting stats, this is pretty much playing time dependent, but I do think it's really interesting on how smart the NFBC draft room is that these stats are pretty much impossible to find later as well. So starting with runs, the threshold we're using is 75. From picks 50 to 100, you have 18 players projected for 75 or more runs. 101 to 150, you've got 9 players. 150 to 200 is 4. 200 to 250 is 2 players. 250 to 300 is 1 player. And there is not a single player outside of ADP 300 that is projected for more than 75 runs. RBIs is very similar. So RBIs, if you use 75 as the benchmark, there are 14 players in picks 50 to 100 that are projected for 75 or more RBIs. 10 players in picks 101 to 150. Only 5, it drops to 5 in 150 to 200. From 200 to 250, there are 2 players with 75 or more projected RBIs. 0 from 250 to 300, and only 1 after pick 300, and that's Andrew Vaughn of the Brewers. I think this tells you how important playing time is in those first 150 picks. We've talked about it in previous podcasts where those picks are truly your foundational picks for your team. Looking at these counting stat numbers, it is even more obvious to me that that is the case. You need to be making sure you're prioritizing playing time, and you are locking in foundational pieces for counting stats on your batting side. Between that and home runs, I think I would be starting to look at power bats with a little bit more intrigue than I might have. Guys who are maybe like 240 or 250 hitters, but have big time power. I've typically shied away from them in the past in early rounds because I feel like my average base is starting to shrink. But in this case, I think the research is telling me that that's probably incorrect. I should be thinking about those big power bats that come with runs and RBIs as well. And I can make up average later, not necessarily putting myself in the basement where I can't recover, but at least not having a 300 average through my first 10 picks, or something crazy like that. I should be relaxing that threshold for average and for speed a little bit early on. You don't want to forget about them, but maybe you can prioritize those later. So that's the outcome of the research on the hitting side of things. Again, average and steals, I think, and we'll talk about those later. I think you can find them, and there's some guys that are, slipping pretty far in drafts that actually fit that bill. But the pitching side of things was just as interesting, if not more. And we'll get into that right now. FBGT. So, of course, pitchers are a little bit more unique, and we're going to start with saves because they're so independent of everything else. Now, for saves, the benchmark I used was 23 saves. And what's interesting is I took the average 80th percentile outcome, which was somewhere between 72 and 76 for 12-team draft and hold, 12-team fab, 15-team draft and hold, and 15-team fab. And I actually divided it by 3. Now, most folks who play in NFBC take a 7 starters and 2 relievers approach, but it is pretty much impossible to find any relievers projected for 35 plus saves. Now, of course, it's going to happen, and we'll talk about maybe some of the things to remember when we kind of wrap up this whole podcast and wrap up the results, that there are some caveats to remember, that projections are kind of hedging their bets a little bit and going for medium outcomes. But when I use 3 closers, it becomes 23 saves. And there are only 7 players in picks ADP 50 to 100 that are projected for 23 or more saves, 6 players between 101 and 150, 1 player between 150 and 200, and then there are no players after that projected for 23 or more saves right now. This does not include Sir Anthony Dominguez. My sheet I haven't really updated my sheet for that yet, but granted, he is closing for the Chicago White Sox, who are notoriously, low with save opportunities. So there's a chance that he might even not make that threshold regardless of having a guaranteed closing spot. But that is 14 closers. Every team needs at least 2. And based on this math, I was talking about using 3 closers, a 6-3 approach to a certain extent. That's why closers get pushed up. This is exactly, we know this already. Closers are essentially get your guys, but it's just important to remember that you need saves and you need a lot of them, and there are only so many to go around. So don't forget that when you're in the draft room. Now, when we switch and start to look at strikeouts and wins, I think these are kind of mirror the results of what we saw on the hitting side of things when we were talking about average and runs, which is to say you can find them later, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it is on the hitter side. So we'll start with strikeouts first, where the threshold was 153 strikeouts. Between ADP 50 and 100, you have 14 pitchers projected for 153 strikeouts. Between picks 101 and 150, there are 12 players. Between picks 150 and 200, there are 11. Between 200 and 250, there are 8. Between 250 and 300, there is 1 player projected for 153 or more strikeouts. And then there are only 6 beyond pick 300 projected for 153 or more strikeouts. On the win side of things, the 80th percentile outcome we used for wins was 10 wins. Now, wins are weird. It's hard to project. But from picks 50 to 100, we have 14 players projected for 10 or more wins. From picks 101 to 150, there are 8. From pick 150 to 200, there are 10. From 200 to 250, there are 8. From 250 to 300, there are 2. And then there are 9 players beyond pick 300 projected for 10 or more wins. So there are options, but there are not as many options. So when you look at Ks especially, you see them fall off a cliff pretty precipitously after pick 250. So you should have a bulk of your starting pitching staff before pick 250 more than likely. You can find some of these guys later. They are players on bad teams, like some of the names were Luis Severino, for instance. Mitch Keller was also in there. They're perfectly adequate, but they're not necessarily guys that you feel lovely about rostering. And wins, again, I don't think there's too much to be said about wins. There's it just tells you that there's, even beyond pick 300, if you're in a draft and hold, there's only 9 players that hit that threshold. So if you were thinking about building up depth on your pitching staff later, you're really not going to find quality depth. And that is even more obvious when you look at the ERA and WHIP findings. So this is where, when I started to actually look at these numbers and kind of look at the players that qualified for this is where my jaw hit the floor. So for ERA, we're talking about a 3.55 ERA. And I set a minimum of 25 innings pitched as the threshold there. So just to weed out anybody who was really low at the bottom with like 5 or 6 innings pitched. From picks 50 to 100, there are 11 players projected with an ERA of 3.55 or lower. From 101 to 150, there are 8 players. From 150 to 200, there are 2 players. From 200 to 250, there is 1 player projected with an ERA lower of 3.55. And from 250 to 300, there are 4. Now, there are 25 plus players after 300 projected for an ERA of 3.55 or lower. But only two are projected for more than 5 wins after pick 100. That's Tyler Glasnow and Zach Wheeler. 2 guys that a lot of people are shying away from. So let me say that again. After pick 100, there are only 2 starters that are projected for more than 5 wins that will have lower than a 3.55 ERA according to my projections. The projections that I'm using, not my projections. There are only 5 players, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that are projected to start any games after pick 100 and have a lower than 3.55 ERA. The WHIP results were even more stark. So if we set the threshold for WHIP to 1.17, which, gotta be honest, doesn't sound like the greatest WHIP, and we use a minimum of 25 innings pitched, there are 5 players projected between picks 50 and 100 with a 1.17 WHIP or lower. There are 5 players projected between 101 and 150 with a 1.17 WHIP or lower. There are 6 players after that projected with a WHIP of 1.17 or lower. So again, it is 10 players between picks 50 and 150, and then 6 players after that in the entire draft pool projected for a WHIP of 1.17 or lower. Only 3 after pick 100 are projected for 20 plus starts, or any starts for that matter. So after pick 100 of 12-team ADP right now, you are only looking at 3 players, and again, I think one of them is Zach Wheeler. I'm pretty sure for WHIP as well. You are looking at 3 players projected for any starts that would be considered quality WHIP providers and ERA providers. That is insane. I could not believe that. Now, this is a really important moment to step back and remember that projections are projecting medium outcomes. So of course there are going to be pitchers that surpass this threshold that get picked later. But the odds of it happening for you are basically 50-50. So if you are waiting to build your pitching staff until later in the draft, you are really going up against the odds that you're going to be able to have a pitching staff that's going to meet these ERA and WHIP thresholds. And this is just the 80th percentile outcome. Imagine if you try and draft to the 90th percentile outcome, which I know some really good players do. You need to be thinking about your ratios. And we know that ERA is not necessarily the most predictable stat, but WHIP, I think, is so important. This to me is massive. It tells me how you need to have a WHIP base built before pick 150. You absolutely need to have your starting pitching staff built by pick 150 in a way that can be stable. Otherwise, you are really going to be fighting against it to maintain ratios that you would consider to be passable. FBGT. So I really enjoyed putting that research together. I thought it was really eye-opening, but I do want to look at maybe some flaws in the exercise, for lack of a better term, or look at it from a different perspective, just so we can balance our opinions before we wrap up here. So there are 3 things I wanted to say. First of which, there's always going to be a young player like Robbie Snelling who finally gets an opportunity in a rotation, or a bat that emerges with 500 plus ABs that we just didn't see coming. Those guys are going to pop later in the draft, and they're not being picked up by these thresholds right now. But when they're given the opportunity, or when their talent starts to emerge, of course they're going to pop. They're going to be guys that should reach some of these thresholds. So you will find these players later. But the point is, statistically speaking, there's not many to come by if you're going by the law of averages right now. Also remember that projections are generally conservative. They're usually using the median outcome, or some sort of like 60 to 70% outcome. So of course they're going to kind of put some of these stats they're going to dampen down some of these stats like home runs, RBIs, because they just know that there's a finite number to go around, and they spread them out relatively evenly because that's what we do. That's what projections are doing. So remember that players are going to pop. And I tried to tease those players out with like Bat X and using Oopsie in the projections that we used for this exercise. But again, more players will emerge because it's just, statistically speaking, you're going to get somebody who reaches their 90th percentile outcome that is drafted way later, and they're going to be a big success for you. And then last but not least, you're always going to have FAB, or in the draft and holds, you have these 50 rounds to pick these guys that pop. So you're going to be able to augment your team further. And the thing about FAB is, it's kind of, when you're putting a high FAB bid on a guy, you're basically saying with certainty that you think that player is going to be performing at a high level. So obviously it doesn't always work out that way. It's not a linear path, but it's just a reminder that you will still have a chance to augment your team later in the season or throughout the season with FAB as well. So don't take everything that we just did as a locked in certainty. You never want to take projections that way, but it just kind of shapes your opinions, and it should be helping you think about maybe where you want to prioritize certain stats, which was the goal today. So when I think about that, and I talked about this earlier, the most obvious thing that stood out to me, or the most fascinating thing that stood out to me again, was the pitching side of things, and how important it was for me to have a starting pitching base, basically by pick 100, but definitely by pick 150. So not just waiting to pick 100 and then picking 4 pitchers, having guys even earlier than that. We ignored the first 50 picks for the purposes of this exercise because so much talent lives up there as well. But if you don't have that pitching staff secure by pick 150, I think you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. On the hitting side of things, it is, again, just a stark reminder of how important prioritizing playing time and stability is going to be, and also maybe leaning a bit more power than you might feel average or stolen bases. So I've talked about it before. I generally do either really good or really bad in average from year to year, and it's because I either prioritize it or I forget about it from year to year. So as of this draft season, I have been looking at average as kind of an important benchmark for me to be keeping track of throughout the draft. But I think I should be switching that even more so to power after looking at this research and seeing how little power is available late. So I'm not looking for the guys that are hitting 210 and are going to completely tank my average, but I do think that I should be thinking more about power than I was leading up to this point based on this research. And then closers are voodoo. Go get your guys. This is the place to get your guys. Try and find that certainty, that role certainty based on the manager, but I don't think anything's changed there other than just reminding myself of how dire the closing situation is on a year-to-year basis. Remember, the goal here is to figure out the weak spots from a statistical standpoint within the draft pool and develop a plan to attack them. How many times have I said to myself that I hate the range between pick 150 or 200 or 200 to 250? Using this research, I think I can lay out a bit more of a solidified game plan, knowing that, okay, in picks 200 to picks 250, that's my last breath for me to get power. So it helps point my focus a little bit and remind me of what I should be thinking about in rounds where I might start to stall out mentally because I'm just not loving what's available to me. So think about this exercise. Think about what you do when you're in the draft, when you're looking at the draft pool later in a draft, and how you tend to respond, and use this to inform your decision maybe in a different way of thinking than you might have before. FBGT. That's right, folks. It's tool time. This week, we're going to talk about the Smart Fantasy Baseball Projection Aggregator. That's right, I'm giving Tanner my love 2 weeks in a row. But I used this tool today to prepare this research, so I really thought it was the perfect time to call it out. So this is yet another spreadsheet that Tanner Bell offers. This one is a paid download. What it allows you to do is it allows you to take multiple projections from Fangraphs and upload them into the sheet, and you're able to aggregate those projections, which, if you've been listening to podcasts lately, is very much in vogue. A lot of people are talking about how it increases your accuracy by mixing projection systems together to kind of keep them in check. So this is what I use this particular spreadsheet for. Other folks have this tool too, don't get me wrong, but what's really cool about the sheet that Tanner Bell offers is it allows you to weight the projections differently, which really allows you to tweak that secret sauce of yours that you're using. So you can weight certain projection systems over others. You can also weight things like playing time projections over others, or flat out ignore playing time projections from certain systems. And that allows me to even tweak my projections with more granularity than that I like to do. So I mentioned it earlier for this podcast. I mixed the Bat X and I mixed ATC on the hitter side, and I put the Bat X a little bit more weighted because I really wanted some of those StatCast metrics to pop when we were doing this, so that it gave us a little bit more results. But I know ATC is notorious for having really good playing time projections, so I actually used their playing time projections 2-1 over the Bat X. On the pitching side, I pretty much just went straight through. I didn't really do any special weightings there, but I really like what this does. It's generally a subtle change. It doesn't make your standings pop too drastically unless you're weighting something in a crazy amount. But, again, this tool rides shotgun to my main Tanner Bell spreadsheet, and it allows me to make my own projections mix and really gives me what I feel like is a great edge in the draft room, an NFBC, and in my home leagues too. All right, I've teased it a few times, so I hope it's worth the wait. It's time for some candy, folks. Thanks for sticking around. The first player we're going to talk about today is Willie Castro. So Willie Castro pops up on my sheet because his playing time projection's been upgraded to 523 plate appearances. This is one of the few players that's going to have a plus 250 average, plus 13 steals, and double-digit home runs, which puts him right around rank 230 in my sheet. We were just talking about it earlier. This is someone who's going to give you a baseline in average, a baseline in steals, and also not be a hindrance on home runs. And his rank is projected almost 200 spots higher than his current ADP. Now, of course, his ADP was a little thrown off before because he wasn't getting an opportunity. He hadn't signed, so it's definitely going to go up. But I don't think it's going to go all the way up to 230, so I think that represents a really interesting buying opportunity for some of our deep league players, or for some of our draft and hold players. Using that same threshold, which is a 250 or better average, at least 13 steals, and double-digit home runs, Jordan Beck also pops here. So this is the outfielder for the Colorado Rockies. Roster Resource has him batting fourth right now. So he meets those same thresholds as Castro, like I said. He's a young guy, and he's already showing as a value with 520 plate appearances. But what if he gets more? If he's batting fourth and he gets some runway and he looks pretty good? The average is the concern there. He's projected for above 250, but I don't think the scouting report actually believes that. He seems like a slightly worse version of Brenton Doyle. He's not as good defensively either, but he's going a bit later, and both of those players kind of feel like goodbyes. So I think he was projected as a 180 rank right now on my sheet using those projection mixes that I talked about earlier. So represents another value here, not a drastic value, but a pretty good buy here, and a guy that can potentially offer you a little bit of steals, a little bit of home runs, a little bit of average, basically not taking away from you anywhere. And if he gets some runway and he breaks out as a 24-year-old player, maybe you got yourself an even better pick. FBGT. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this episode of FBGT. I hear my neighbor's snowblower running, so I think that's my cue. Thank you so much for sticking around for this one. I'll try and have another episode out at some point next week. If you're listening on YouTube, you can check it out on Spotify. It's also on Apple Podcasts as well. If it's missing from one of your podcast platforms, just let me know. Someone gave me a shout that it was missing from a certain platform. I haven't figured out which one, but if it is, just let me know and I'll try and get it on there as well. I'm really appreciative of the support. I haven't mentioned it a few times. I'm right around 500 listens right now. Apparently, everybody's really engaged. We just hit 50 followers on the iTunes. I keep calling it iTunes on the Apple Spotify crowd. So, we're really humming along. I'm so thankful for the support. I've heard some great words. I've gotten some DMs as well from folks just reaching out and let me know that to keep the train rolling. That's what we're gonna do. So, as always, I hope to see you in a draft room. And until then, stay warm and have a great evening. FB.